So as an American chairing this session, I think it would be horribly insensitive to my Swiss host not to start exactly on time. So this session, is on the varieties of mystical experience. It's a fascinating, the varieties of religious experience. A fascinating topic. I think the only potential downside is we might owe some royalties to the descendants of William James. But in all seriousness, I think William James would be proud. I'm Matt Johnson. I'm an experimental psychologist at Johns Hopkins. I'll be speaking later on psychedelic drugs at 2 p.m. But we have two speakers for this session on varieties of religious experience. And those are Nathaniel Barrett and Jeff Kreipel. So right now I'll introduce our first speaker. This is Nathaniel Barrett. He's from the University of Navarra at Pamplona. And please help me in welcoming Dr. Barrett.
Thank you. First of all, thank you to Harold and the organizers for the invitation to speak and the wonderful program. So my talk is called Religion as a Technology of the Imagination. I want to begin with a little bit of background and context to orient you. So I'm a philosopher, and when I work on religion, I see my role as trying to contribute on the theoretical side to the study of religion. So the study of religion is actually not a discipline, it's a swarm of disciplines. And what I try to do is contribute to that swarm, pitch in my 2 cents, by proposing different ways of thinking about religion, which I hope are fruitful for inquiry. And in particular, one of my goals is to contribute to the improvement of naturalistic or scientific approaches to the study of religion. And one of the major challenges for those kinds of approaches is religious experience. I think it's fair to say that naturalistic approaches, especially cognitive approaches, are often neglectful of the experience of religion as it is practiced and lived. And I believe this limitation is theoretical and empirical. If we lack theoretical resources for engaging the experiential dimension of religion, it often fails to show up for inquiry. So how can we do better? Probably has occurred to you that we cannot develop a better approach to religious experience without an adequate understanding of experience in general, right? And as you are well aware, we do not yet have an established scientific theory of experience or consciousness. But perhaps the study of religious experience, if well framed, does not have to wait for this theory. So perhaps the study might actually contribute to consciousness studies and vice versa. So my proposal is that to connect the study of consciousness with the study of religious experience, we should think about religion as a technology of the imagination. Moreover, I will argue that this approach demands something from the science of consciousness. What it demands is a non-Kantian or non-synthetic theory of the imagination. And of course, I'm going to need to tell you what I mean by that. But first, I just want to delineate the kinds of religious experience that I'm most interested to treat in terms of the imagination. So the term religious experience has a long and very troubled history, and which I cannot get into, but just let it suffice to say that when scholars take up religious experience of an object of study, they tend to focus on what might be called the most extraordinary varieties of religious experience. So rare, fleeting, but powerful and momentous experiences, which I think are important. I don't mean to discount or dismiss them, but almost as a rule, many of these experiences, you cannot learn to have them. They simply happen to you. In contrast, I'm more interested to focus on experiences which I call ordinary, but they're only ordinary in the sense that they can be learned and cultivated through religious practice or participation. And I hope it is clear to you that this is a very broad category containing diverse ranges of experiences. Maybe not all of the religious experiences contained in this category, but it's big enough to work with. Here are pictures of various activities that we might consider religious. They look religious. We might think that some of the participants in these activities are experiencing these activities religiously. But I want to, before I move on, suggest another broad distinction within this category, which is, I think, very important to keep in mind. And that is the distinction between experience of religious activities and the religious experience of everyday life. As you notice that one of these photos is not quite like the others. There's a woman riding a bicycle, and you might think, well, that's not a religious experience. Well, maybe, maybe not. It's important to keep in mind that one of the goals of religious practice for many people is to change their way of experiencing everyday life, right? And any approach to ordinary religious experience should try to keep that goal in mind, try to understand what it means and how it is possible. So now let's move to the imagination. So this is the hardest part of my talk, especially for me, because I have to be clear about a complicated problem, which, to be honest, I'm still figuring out how to approach. Also, I want to warn you that my way of thinking about the imagination kind of goes against the grain, not only of common sense understanding of the imagination, or at least some senses, but also most philosophical understandings of the imagination. So what do I mean? Let's start with some dictionary definitions taken from Merriam-Webster. This is not a complete set of senses of imagination, but it'll do. I think a complete theory of the imagination needs to handle all of these and maybe more. But notice that some of them are quite different. In particular, I've highlighted for you that this first sense, the power forming a mental image of something not present, suggests departure from reality, whereas the second sense, to be, to ability to confront and deal with a problem, suggests coming to grips with reality. But all sense of the imagination, they have to do with some creative activity of the mind. Now, in contemporary philosophy, the sense of the imagination that is most often treated is the first sense, and that's contrasted with perception. However, if you know something about the history of philosophy, you probably know that there's a different sense of the imagination that comes from Kant. And for Kant, the imagination is a necessary ingredient in perception. In fact, for Kant, all conscious experience is a product of the imagination. And from now on, for the next few slides, I'm going to be sort of developing this idea of the imagination. Why did Kant think that? Well, Kant's arguments about the imagination are notoriously obscure and complicated, but fortunately, all we need today is the gist, right? And it can be summarized more or less as follows, that the imagination synthesizes, connects, brings together different items into a unified complex. So, in short, the creative activity of the imagination is a constructive synthesizing activity. So then why is a synthesizing activity necessary for experience? Well, the answer is, for Kant, and for a great many philosophers and scientists after him, imaginative synthesis is necessary for experience because experience is full of unified images that it is widely assumed are not present to the senses. So what do I mean by these unified images? Well, here's a sort of a representative list. It's not complete. This comes from Stevenson, of the kinds of unities of experience. You can also call them, these are the images of experience, which we need to account for. More could be added to the list. The main ones are perceptual objects, also just the whole of perceptual experience. Let's accept that these unities are a part of experience, right? And the question before us is how to account for them. Now, the problem as it's usually framed is that the experience of the world, objects within it, is always unified and whole. And yet it seems that we are only in direct sensory contact with bits and pieces. That's how the problem is framed. So accordingly, the Kantian view is that because these unified whole images are not supported by sensory input, they have to be synthesized by the mind. Right? This is the job of the imagination. Right? All the images of experience, so objects of perception as well as experience as a whole, are synthesized by the imagination. Right? Notice that this view of experience explains why the term imagination, even in the sense that is usually opposed to perception, is in fact the basis for perception. Because according to Kantians, to have a perceptual experience of the world, it is necessary to imagine parts of the world that are not present. Right? So we do not have a good theory of how this synthesizing work is done by the brain, at least not to my knowledge. And in neuroscience, this question is sometimes known as the binding problem. Now notice that the binding problem starts from the premise that experience needs to be bound together from different elements. So in this respect, I suggest to you that everyone who works on the binding problem in philosophy and neuroscience adheres to a Kantian view of the imagination, whether or not they care about or have even heard of Kant. Right? So in fact, the philosopher Alan Thomas has argued that no other explanation seems feasible. I'm quoting. It seems that Kant's view is really the only game in town. Now, I suggest to you that, especially if you're a philosopher, but also a scientist or just any critical thinker, whenever someone says that a theory is the only game in town, an alarm should go off in your head, right? And indeed, I want an alternative theory. So this is an important twist in my argument. I agree that the unities of experience are essential features that must be accounted for by any theory of consciousness. But I want to find another approach that does not assume that these unities must be products of synthesis. So I want to develop an alternative non-synthetic theory of imagination. So why am I interested in doing that, right? There are many ways to motivate the search for a non-Kantian theory of imagination, and I can only just briefly give you a couple reasons here. A big reason is the mess of epistemological problems that attend this picture of experience. So simply put, if the images of experience are synthetic, then experience must be strongly representational in the sense that many of us want to avoid. So to put the point very sharply, it seems that on this view, to have experience of the world, we actually have to lose touch with the world. And that seems a big price to pay. Another possible problem is that I don't think that Kantian imagination accounts very well for perceptual learning. That's more controversial, and I can go into that point in more detail later on. But I think that Kantian learning is very strained to account for the way experience and perception change through learning. And if that's the case, you don't have to take my word for it, but if it is the case, then what I'm really interested in this talk, which is learned religious experience, is going to be very difficult to handle with a Kantian theory of imagination, right? So that's the motivation within the context of this talk. So where can we look for resources for a non-Kantian or non-synthetic theory of imagination? Well, there are plenty of places to look. What's important for me in particular is pragmatism. In science, especially ecological psychology, I think is an indispensable resource for trying to think of imagination in non-synthetic terms. Also helpful coordination dynamics and neurodynamics. What I'm going to do now is just sketch the outlines of what I think a non-synthetic theory of imagination is going to look like in just very broad terms. And the starting point should be, this is one of the other definitions from the previous slide. It's the second one, the ability to confront and deal with a problem. So let's just think of, what if imagination is about that primarily? I propose then that images are actually ways of grasping. And they are ways of getting a finely articulated but unified grip on our surroundings. Secondly, I propose that images are specified by flows of sensory stimulation rather than synthesized from sense data. Thirdly, I propose that we think of imagination first and foremost as for action, right? It is for the fine-tuned control of behavior. And finally, I think this can be sort of summarized, and this is sort of the catchword for my approach, is that imagination is engagement. Actually, this word comes from another author, Neville, over there. So let's talk about engagement a little bit. The reason why I think this term is so helpful for thinking about imagination in a non-synthetic way is that, first of all, it implies interaction rather than construction. So in common usage, engagement connotes a way of reaching out so as to stay in touch with the world, right? When we are engaged, we are actively, directly connected with our surroundings. So finally, it is, when you think about imagination and engagement, it's critical to remember that engagement is different from what we know about or believe about the world. Regardless of what we know or believe, what is not engaged imaginatively does not enter into experience directly, and so cannot enter into the control of behavior in the way that experience allows. So other terms that I think help flesh out this concept of engagement, one is enhancement. I think that experiential engagement always involves some kind of enhancement. And what I mean by that is basically the way in which certain dynamic variables are focused on and enhanced, and they're enhanced in the way that continuous variation is often turned into contrast. And so color vision is, I think, the prime example of the contrastive enhancement of variation. And I think that contrast is the texture of experience, and that texture is what gives us a grip on the world. Now, enjoyment is also essential, I think, to this understanding of engagement. It basically has to do with the tension inherent, the striving and satisfaction of experience. I would say that our experiential grasp of the world is charged with value, and it has to be if it is to be a form of agency or being in the world. Now, let's move on. A good way to flesh out this picture of imagination is to consider how the imaginative activity of experience is expressed and displayed by the arts. Now, this thesis, actually, that the arts constitute sort of an organic extension, intensification, and expression of the imaginative power of the mind, has been argued most famously by John Dewey in his Art as Experience and by Suzanne Langer in Mind, an Essay on Human Feeling. And basically, this approach can be summarized as the analogy that you see here. The imaginative work of the artist, it is proposed, begins with experience, sort of like everyday experience, and is analogous to the work of the imagination that is responsible for experience itself. So therefore, by examining the imagery of the arts and comparing aesthetic experience, and I mean all the arts, although I'm going to focus on visual arts here, comparing aesthetic experience with everyday experience, we can learn something about the imagery of consciousness and the work done by the imagination. Now, it can get a little bit confusing, so notice that there are two levels now of imagery and imagination at work in this theory. It compares these two levels. So you have artistic imagery, or imagery 2, which we can perceive, right? And then we have conscious imagery, which we cannot perceive because it's what we perceive with, right? But the idea is that our fundamental conscious imagery, which we cannot perceive, is expressed, distilled, and intensified by artistic imagery. But above all, it is rendered in perceptual form. It is made perceivable. So as I will discuss in a moment, this process of distillation and perceptualization provides us with leverage on our way of experiencing, and it allows us to change experience. So this thesis helps to illustrate points I made earlier about the imagination. So an artistic image, and this is sort of a painting of a buffalo. It's a reproduction of the painting of a buffalo in the caves of Altamira in Spain. It selectively extracts and enhances some aspect of our experience so that it can be enjoyed perceptively, right? So with respect to its materials, the imaginative activity of the arts may be synthetic, But I suggest that in relation to everyday experience, aesthetic experience can be viewed as a distillation or an intensification of what is already there in experience. So think about how we can and do use the imagery of the arts to engage our own experience. In great literature or poetry, I think this is often the case, as well as all the other arts. So one last point about the artistic imagination. One of its key features is its extraordinary versatility, allowing for the production of an endless variety of images. And I would say that this too is expressive of the human mind and its power of imagination in more basic terms, which is uniquely flexible and versatile. I suggest that actually no other animal has our flexibility of the imagination. And this is evidenced, for example, by our inventive use of tools. Now, other animals use tools, and in so doing, they display their power of imagination. But only we can look at a stick and see countless different uses, right? This is imaginative flexibility, and I believe it's the key to human intelligence. In turn, our ability to flexibly change our imaginative grasp of the world in everyday life supports another special capacity, which is the capacity to cultivate distinctive experiences and ways of experiencing. So this is what I call the technology of the imagination. To see what I mean by this technology, first consider the wondrous flexibility of our imagination in everyday life, supportive of an endless variety of experiences, but still constrained by habits or patterns that define what I call our imaginative repertoire. Now, our imaginative repertoire is our continually evolving set of possible imagery constrained by habits of engagement. And some of our repertoire might be species general. Much of it is shared. It might be culturally specific and shared in that sense. But a lot of it is also individual. So in the sense that each of us is capable of an endless variety of experiences, but at the same time you could say that each of us has a different way of experiencing, that is to be explained by this concept of imaginative repertoire, which obviously needs to be fleshed out. Imaginative repertoire must be shared, but also individual. So broadly speaking, a technology of the imagination is any technique for working directly on or with the imaginative repertoire. So these techniques can be used simply for enjoyment, as they often are, or they can be used to alter the repertoire and thus our capacity for engagement. So the earliest and most important, I think, tool for this work is the use of created imagery, as in the arts, right? To cultivate intensified experience, and thereby to gain leverage on the more fundamental imagery of our repertoire, and thereby reshape and redirect everyday experience. So this is a proposal of how that could work, right? So then, obviously, we can think of religion as a technology of the imagination. I want to go a little bit one step further and propose a thesis that, in fact, cultivation of the imagination is at the core of religiosity. That's a very strong claim, but I think it's an interesting one to consider. I'm willing to put it forward and argue for it. And it goes against the grain of a lot of modern thinking about religion, which is very belief-centered, right? But I think that you could probably see that it is possible, I'm not discounting religious beliefs, but it is possible to have religious beliefs, but to be without religious imagination. And what I mean by that is an imaginative repertoire that has been shaped by participation in religious practice. So the big question is, what distinguishes religion as a technology of the imagination from other kinds, right? So if you're hoping I'm going to make a grand claim about the nature of religion, well, I'm about to disappoint you. But there is some consolation, because I think the most important fruit of a theoretical approach, which is all I'm offering here, is not so much what allows us to conclude, but that is directly without further inquiry, but the kinds of questions that allows us to explore and how it allows us to explore those questions. So how does looking at religion as a technology of imagination sort of direct inquiry? So two suggestions. One is to look at the imagery that's used and sort of to say, well, I think religious technology of the imagination involves special kinds of imagery. And we might say that supernatural imagery is what is involved. principally in religious technology of the imagination. Another way, I think, potentially more fruitful for consciousness studies is to look at it as a special kind of engagement. Right? We can look at the imagery, but we're also interested in what is being engaged with the imagery of religion. So what is engaged by the religious imagination? So it's a very difficult question, lots of different answers. The kinds of answers depend on what we think can be engaged imaginatively and also what we think is important to engage. Right? So, for example, aspects of life that are existentially important, like suffering, dependence, contingency, call out for some kind of engagement. And so we might look at religion as a technology for engagement with those kinds of realities or aspects of reality. But it is crucial to remember, and this is a key point, that imaginative engagement is experiential, it's not intellectual. Knowing or believing something about the world does not amount to engagement. So, for example, all of us know something about how all life depends on the sun, but few of us engage this aspect of our reality because we lack imagery for bringing it into our experience and connecting it with our life, with our community, and with everything that we hold dear. So, in contrast, many ancient cultures, you probably know, though comparatively deficient in knowledge about the sun, were much better equipped to engage the sun as a source of life or the source of life through elaborate rituals and ceremonies. So here's an example. What you're looking at is the megalithic site of Newgrange that's near Dublin, Ireland. It is older than Stonehenge. The culture that made this site is long gone. Probably wondering, why did I pick an example that's so old? Couldn't I have picked a more recent example? Well, I like Newgrange actually partly because it's so old and so little is left of the culture that made it. I'll explain why in a moment. For me, it's a very clear and striking example of what I mean by religious engagement. So this site it's ingeniously made so that at sunrise on the winter solstice, the first rays of the sun enter a special opening above the door and enter this tunnel and illuminate a central chamber of this structure. It still works, and the effect is stunning. So we don't know what this means for the culture that built it, right? But that's part of why it's useful for me. The complete absence of everything that surrounded its original use is helpful because all that we have left of this religious culture is a remnant of its imaginative core. So all that this is a tool for engagement, and moreover, its contribution to engagement should be obvious. So Newgrange is essentially, it's a giant magnification device. It aims at the turning point of the sun that marks the peak of winter, something barely perceptible to the naked eye, although you can see it, and it blows this up into this intensely dramatic experience of light flooding into total darkness, right? And so, again, we do not know how this sudden illumination was intentionally engaged by the culture that made this. Nevertheless, I suggest to you that Newgrange exemplifies something common to all forms of religious engagement. How am I doing with time? Okay, I think I will end there. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it to Jeffrey.
And we'll go straight into our next talk, and we're going to have a nice, good chunk of time for questions and answer for both of our speakers at the very end. So now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, Jeff Kripal from Rice University, Houston. So please help me welcome Dr. Kripal.
Thank you. These papers actually pair well together. Nathaniel's was very much, as he said, about the ordinary elements of religion. My talk is about the extraordinary, and in some ways isn't really about religion at all. It's about proto-religion. And I think the question of how we get from these proto-religious experiences to religion is a big question we really haven't addressed yet. A man named John Morgan wrote me recently after reading The Flip, a recent book of mine. A flip is a life-changing moment often catalyzed by trauma or some other extreme event in which a person enters an altered state of consciousness and subsequently reverses or flips her or his metaphysical perspective. Once holding to a strong materialist position in which consciousness is understood to be an evolutionary accident or a purely local epiphenomenon of brain processes, the flipped individual is now convinced that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the cosmos and not reducible to neurological or biological processes. Back to John Morgan. John is a professional copywriter in Los Angeles. His letter is an especially eloquent but fairly typical example of the kinds of letters I receive almost every week and have been receiving for about a decade now, since I began writing and speaking in public about what I call the impossible. Here is John's flip in his own words. So this is the actual letter from John. I live in San Francisco. I was asleep one night in 2002 when I was awakened by the sound of a horrific car crash at the intersection outside my window. I heard the screech of brakes and then a violent crash. I bolted awake. My heart was pounding. My first thought was go outside, get the victim's help. I ran out of my house, but when I looked to the intersection, there was nothing. No smashed cars and no evidence of an accident, nor any cars at all. I was dumbfounded. It didn't feel like a dream. It was much more specific. What woke me up was a distinct experience of sound as opposed to something visual. My dreams are almost exclusively visual, so it didn't make sense. This was a dream. Still, I put myself back to bed and told myself it was probably a dream, however unique it felt. The next day, I went to work and followed my normal routine and went to bed around 11 p.m. Then in the middle of the night while I slept, I heard the exact same accident I heard the night before. The violent screech of brakes, the tremendous impact of metal on metal. Again, I bolted up in bed. I distinctly remember being confused. Is this last night? Why is this repeating? What's going on? After a moment trying to process all of this, I heard someone outside on the street shout something like, "Oh my God, somebody get help." At that point, I felt this wave of adrenaline rush through my body all at once. I realized this was in fact a different night than the previous one, and this time the accident was real. I ran outside and a car had been T-boned, rolled several times, and landed in my neighbor's yard. I learned later that a young man in the car died. Later that night, I broached the subject with myself. Did I in fact have a precognition of the accident? A prosaic rationale would have been coincidence, but the odds of a searingly real dream of an accident coming the night before an actual accident seemed too great. I'd never dreamed of car accidents before. Besides, both of the crashes as I experienced them were exact. Same time of night, same location, same sounds. I didn't know what happened, but I knew it wasn't coincidence and was something supernatural, or whatever it should be called. End of letter. We could now proceed for the rest of my talk with story after story like John's. Indeed, this is the water in which I professionally swim or drown. I am a historian of religions. I try to understand these extraordinary experiences across cultural and temporal boundaries by placing them on a broad comparative table in order to make sense of them not as disconnected, unrelated parts, but as a meaningful whole that suggests particular truths about the human and about religion. But I won't tell you these stories. I don't have the time. I also fully understand that as neither a physicist nor a philosopher, I am something of an invited guest at your interdisciplinary table. My intention then is not to tell you how to do what you all do so well. My goal is to provide you with some thoughts from another discipline in the hope that something here might provide you with a few clues or provocations about where you might want to go next. Stories like John's can be approached in at least two different ways. One historical and descriptive, or what we call phenomenological, and one philosophical and normative. To think in a more granular fashion, I like to imagine two bars that we can attempt to jump or pole vault over here to employ an image from my failed days as a track and field athlete. The first bar comes down to a single question. Do such things really happen? Or are they really non-events, functions perhaps of miscalculated coincidences, meaningless statistical outliers, or neurological blips of the pattern-seeking brain? Put more technically, do such events take place in both the mental and the material dimensions of human experience, or are they a simple function of bad thinking, bad probability, projection, pathology, illusion, and so on? The same question can be put in the terms of a much simpler one. Why do people believe impossible things? My own answer to the latter question goes something like this. People believe impossible things because impossible things happen to people. People around the world believe in a soul that is separable from the body because people around the world have experienced their own souls or those of others separating from their bodies in all sorts of situations. People around the world believe in some form of reincarnation because small children routinely remember in great detail their previous lives and report them to their parents and family. Especially, it turns out, when their previous lives allegedly ended violently, suddenly, and unjustly. People around the world practice dream divination because people around the world occasionally dream of the future before it happens, like John, and so on. The impossible is not impossible at all, it turns out. The impossible is simply a function of our own present physicalist belief systems, which declares all sorts of well-attested capacities and human potentials impossible because they are incompatible with that reigning system and its modes of knowing. Put most simply, our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. And we have excluded a lot. If we put back on the table much of what we have taken off the table over the last few hundred years so that we could control the rules of the game and manipulate and measure all the stuff that we allowed on the table, our conclusions will inevitably change, and so will we. The impossible will become possible. Please note that the historian or student of the religions does not need to believe any of the belief systems that build up around such extraordinary experiences to appreciate the utter reasonableness and power of such beliefs. To invoke another story documented in the literature, if any of us had a disturbing dream the night before a school field trip that our young daughter would be left lying asleep on the train tracks in mortal danger, and exactly that happened the next day as we worried all day at home, most of us, I think really all of us, would seriously entertain a belief in precognitive dreams, whatever our earlier education or training told us. We would not need to believe in God or prayer or guardian angels. We would only need to accept the facts of our own troubling experience. It's really that simple. Belief as intellectual assent to some past creedal statement is perfectly irrelevant in such contexts. It is a simple matter of empiricism, honesty, and in this case, a parent's well-founded anxiety. The first bar then is not too difficult to get over. All one really needs is a certain level of hermeneutical charity and sympathy, or a child lying on the train tracks. Once one is over the first bar, the second bar quickly appears. The second bar comes down to the question of origin or cause. If these phenomena are a part of our mental material world, how exactly do they work? Are there mechanisms involved, or is the search for mechanism misplaced, and we should be looking for meaning and purpose? Such questions in turn lead naturally to another. Can such phenomena tell us something important about ourselves, about the nature of consciousness as such? Take John's experience. If we accept that such an event happened in both his dream world the first night and outside his window the second, and I do, then such events may well point to something very profound about human consciousness, and in particular about the location of consciousness in time. The event suggests, after all, that consciousness, particularly when altered by the emotional gravity of nightmare and impending tragedy, may not be entirely located in what we call the present. The now of consciousness might be much more extended or expansive than we think. We might not be the prisoners of history and time that we imagine. Which leads me to the third bar. The third bar asks, but if these impossible phenomena in fact take place in both the mental and material dimensions, the first bar, and suggest something about the nature of consciousness, the second bar, might they also signal or sign to us fundamental truths about the physical universe, of which we are long evolved expressions? Might such phenomena have something important to say about the behavior and structure of space, time, energy, and matter? Take John's precognitive nightmare again. It is hardly just a dream. It is also a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment just begging to be thought. And once thought, it clearly implies or leads to something like the philosophical position of eternalism, or a block cosmology in which the future already exists. His precise precognitive hearing of something in the near future does not prove such a cosmology, of course, but it clearly acts as a very suggestive sign of the same. It goads us, teases us to explore in that particular direction. It is a broken twig on the hunt, a sign along the way, but only if we recognize the twig as a sign. Only if we know how to read the subtle signs of the forest floor on our intellectual hunt. I'm going to skip this slide here. It's a good example of what I'm talking about. Please note that I am not asking you to believe anything, nor am I claiming any certain knowledge. I am simply saying I think we should move in that direction. I am reading the broken twigs on the forest floor to find the elk herd. I am suggesting that there are living thought experiments all around us, if only we would take them up and think them. In this same little spirit, allow me to share my own intellectual wagers with you. First, a general ontological wager, then 4 more specific suggestions. My most general intellectual wager is that the total gestalt gleaned or intuited from comparative mystical literature, which is my own area of study, strongly suggests that consciousness and the cosmos are 2 modes or expression of the same fundamental reality, manifesting in us as knowing and experiencing subjects. The world is one, although it becomes 2 in our experiences when we split it up in our knowing and sensing. That is, when we become human subjects and are socialized into various reigning worldviews and identities. We don't do this consciously or intentionally, much less as individuals. We do this by virtue of being born into a specific body, language, family, and community, and becoming socialized persons who know physical objects, that is, who split the world up into 2 basic dimensions of experience, the mental and the material, the cultural and the natural. Reality always remains something other or more in its ground, but it also becomes all of the things, egos, and cultural worlds that we know and believe up here. Reality is one, but it also really becomes 2. In short, I lean strongly to some sort of monistic picture in a dual aspect or neutral mode, Harold's Jung-Pauli conjecture. By the way, that's Harold in the red cape teaching me physics. I'm the guy on the left, Harold's on the right. Not really, but... I have employed this ontology in my published work to understand what I call the impossible, or what is colloquially called the paranormal. as a meaningful collapse of the subject-object structure, that is, as a temporary revelation of the dual aspect, monistic nature of reality. It is my opinion, my wager, that such paradoxical experiences are anything but philosophical fluff or neurological blips. They are important signs on the forest floor pointing to a cosmos that is profoundly connected, that is one world in which impossible dreams like that of John Morgan become entirely possible. This partial or complete collapse of the subject-object structure, known partly and darkly in impossible experiences and more fully and directly in mystical experiences, point to what I want to call the future of knowledge. If such a future of knowledge strikes you as too friendly to the gorilla of religion in our living room, allow me to remind you that modern science and technology have not somehow eliminated modern people's spiritual sensibilities. Quite the contrary, they have been wildly productive of new spiritual ideas and expressions. Think the near-death or psychedelic literatures, or the ever-increasing literature on the philosophy of quantum physics, none of which would have happened without the advances of biomedical technology in the near-death case, modern chemistry in the psychedelic case, or, of course, quantum physics in the physics case. Nor would have such modern literatures happened without the central role of the scientists themselves. The quantum philosophy literature was not born in the counterculture in the 1960s or 70s. It was born at the beginning of quantum mechanics in founding figures like Schrödinger, Bohr, and Pauli, each of whom saw the profound philosophical parallels or correspondences that resonate between these different forms of human experience, the mathematical and the mystical. Allow me to end with a few suggestions, signs on the forest floor again, that I intuit in both the comparative mystical literature, but also in my personal correspondence with those hundreds of living individuals whom I affectionately call my mutants. That is, all of those stunned, traumatized, zapped, or literally lightning-struck human beings who seek me out, wisely or no, for advice, moral support, and simple human understanding. There are 4 such signs of the future of us. You can hear them as attempted leaps over the 3 bars, as flips, or, if you prefer, as flops. But you will hear them, I dare say, not as they are, but as you are. First, if I have anything to say to such a distinguished group of scientists and philosophers, it is this: please stop doing philosophy of mind exclusively around or in only one state of consciousness. Philosophizing on the uniqueness or qualia of mintiness, redness, or ordinary ego can only get us so far, which is about where we are right now. I personally see no good reason why this socialized, sense-based state of consciousness should have a monopoly on truth or our place in the cosmos. Actually, I see all kinds of good reasons why it should not possess such a monopoly. If comparative mystical literature means anything, it means this: do not believe what you believe. Do not think what you think. Consciousness is not cognition. Consciousness is not culture. Consciousness is not ego. Such ordinary states of mind hide, camouflage, or distract from a deeper, more fantastic reality. There is another world, a reality that cannot be languaged or cognized in any ordinary way. The history of science suggests the same, of course. As Aldous Huxley observed many decades ago now, one can stare at water for years or centuries and never guess that it is composed of 2 invisible gases bound to one another by entirely invisible forces. One must expose water to extreme conditions and have the proper instruments to establish this fact. Something similar, Huxley pointed out, is true of human beings and the human spirit. One can stare at a human being or oneself for years or decades and never imagine that such a being is capable of entirely different states of consciousness, until, that is, such a human being is exposed to extreme or extraordinary conditions and splits apart into two. Huxley's metaphor is even more relevant today as we spend billions of dollars on the Hadron Collider, just a few miles from here below us, to inflict the most exquisite, precise, and extreme violence on matter in order to fathom its otherwise completely unknown and unknowable components. This, I want to suggest to you, is more or less what comparative mystical literature gives us, those extreme or traumatic revelations of who and what we really are. Mystical literature is the Hadron Collider of human history. Accordingly, we should go there to understand the nature of consciousness as such. But we should go there with discernment and the appropriate hermeneutical training. This is my second point, which brings me to this, that we must work toward a better understanding of the imagination. This kind of fuses well with Nathaniel's comments. I continue to think that the imagination is the key to understanding and reading the signs of the impossible, or people's paranormal experiences. Intellectuals commonly trip over such extreme experiences because they are often coded in Baroque or fantastic imagery. Intellectuals reject such experiences because they literalize these visionary codes and cannot see through or beyond them. To complicate matters further, sometimes the imagination moves in the opposite direction and functions as a kind of supersense, even when it employs the stuff of dreams and visions. Its products should be read more literally here. Consider again John's experience. The nightmare audition or hearing was employing the altered states of consciousness of dream. And yet it was also a correct cognition of an all too empirical future event. How are we supposed to understand this mixing of the real and imagined with our present models of the imagination as just the imaginary? Third, I believe the textual and historical evidence for some kind of divinatory capacity of the human mind is overwhelming for anyone who chooses to spend the years necessary to examine the evidence. This same evidence, moreover, suggests some kind of block cosmology of space-time unity, that is, some kind of universe in which the future already exists and can flow backwards in time to signal itself to a human being, often again in highly symbolic or indirect ways. I have given a number of examples of this block time phenomena elsewhere, but the anthropologist Eric Wargo has given us access to hundreds in his recent work on what he so elegantly calls the tesseract of the human brain and its creative time loops. Fourthly, and most speculatively, and this is my last suggestion, I would like to suggest that if we are really serious about locating the precise locus in the human body where consciousness is initially received, translated by the imagination, and eventually transformed into a person, we should not just be looking in the brain. We should also be looking at the heart region. I say this because this is what the comparative mystical literature suggests, not very clearly and certainly not universally, but strongly enough to look into this possibility. Finally, I really do understand how all of this is speculative, if not actually eccentric. I understand that these broken twigs on the forest floor may lead us not to our protein-rich elk herd, but into a barren valley or over a cliff. I could be wrong, very wrong, about any one or all of this. I still think it's all worth making and thinking about. We need to think big and bold. We need to think otherwise now. We need to flip. Thank you very much.
So we have about a good block of 25 minutes for questions and answers, and I'm sure there's going to be quite a few questions about those talks. So if I can, however you want to prefer to do it, if our two speakers could come and sit on stage, since you're already mic'd up with your headsets. We'll follow the tradition of going back and forth between the two microphones. So if you do have a question, please get in one of these two lines. And so we'll start over here.
Yes. My question is primarily
they
for
might be turned on.
Jeffrey Krippal, but also as well as the first speaker as well. And my question is basically where we went wrong. My personal opinion in science. My personal opinion is it was with Francis Bacon, although that's perhaps being too detailed and saying, blaming one person. He's actually my uncle, way back. But, but he seems to have adopted the attitude, from what I've read, that the hoi polloi, the ordinary people, should not be exposed to psychic phenomena and psychic events. And so he got a bunch of cabal of people together, that would not talk about that publicly, but do it. Publicly, he would say, there is no such thing. We're just going to do the scientific method. We're going to get rid of superstition. What's your opinion about that?
I don't know I don't think we went wrong anywhere. I think science has proceeded spectacularly by actually avoiding all of the things it cannot address. I think that's what science is a decision to ignore what cannot be explained with the scientific method and to focus on what can. So I'm not sure that's going wrong. I also think a lot of scientists are in the metaphysical closet. I think they have these experiences, or their family members do. They know they happen. They just don't know what to do with them, and they don't want to sound like the tabloids or like a professor of religion. So they don't. And I also think there's a sociology of knowledge here. Scientists are very high in the politics of the academy. They have a tremendous amount of prestige. Professors of religion have zero prestige. So we have a freedom that they don't have. So I think that does determine what can be said and can't be said.
And yet at the same time, a few people have broken out of that mold. For instance, ions and, of course, Pear, Robert John, Dean Radin, and others who are willing to explore this with scientific methods.
Absolutely. They've come out of the closet.
Anything, Nathaniel, from you on this?
I agree with Jeffrey's answer. I would just sort of add, I also agree, I don't think it was so much a failure, but part of the success of modern science and its birth, as I understand it, had to do with being able to mathematize reality. I think that was key to getting experimental science going. And the mechanistic materialism metaphysics that allowed for mathematization is not very good for understanding a lot of things, but it was very good for that, and that was a crucial turning point. You just make a comparison with Chinese metaphysics around the same time. I'm a fan of Chinese philosophy, and I think in many ways it helps us to understand post-Einsteinian physics maybe better than Western kinds of metaphysics, but it's not good for mathematization. And so science didn't get started in China. It got started in the West. So.
Oh, thank you.
So we'll go over to the other microphone.
Yes, I have a question for Jeffrey Krippal, and thank you for a brilliant talk. My question is to ask you why you're not choosing to compare these experiences within Western modernity or postmodernity with other cultures that have been far more open to what I would call ontological boundary crossing, space-time boundary crossing events. And I'm thinking particularly, say, of animistic and shamanistic cultures. If I were to cite from Graham Harvey, he says, we have always been animists. So in a certain sense, there's an interpretation of repression going on. Yeah? So we could say Western culture is repressed. And in a certain sense, you're drawing from this kind of return of the repressed in Western culture, which would make a really beautiful comparison with non-modern cultures, such as indigenous, shamanistic, and animist cultures. And I'm just curious why you choose not to go there.
Well, I do go there, of course. I mean, that's what I do professionally, is I compare things. Are you referring to the talk or to the broader project?
Broader project.
Yeah, I certainly am interested in indigenous cultures. Are you just talking about indigenous cultures now, or are you talking about something else?
Let's perhaps I could say animistic
Animistic.
cultures.
Yeah, all scholars of religion are limited by their training. We end up studying a few cultures, and we can't master or do everything. And I was actually trained in Indian religion and Indian philosophy. I was not trained in anything indigenous. And so I focused there, and I was also trained in Western Christianity. So we all tend to kind of focus wherever we are trained, but it doesn't mean that we're not, or I'm not interested in all of those other contexts and cultures. Of course I am. It's just really a matter of human finitude, I think. We just can't do everything. So that's not really an answer. I agree with you completely. I think I think we are talking about a kind of Western animism or a panpsychism, to use the more current term. But I think these have profound connections to these older religious systems.
Great. Okay, back over to this microphone.
First, I'd like to thank the speakers for engaging talk. This question is for Nathaniel. Question and a comment, and you started with an image of a cave painting, and it is known that the ancient cave painters a lot of times completed something that pre-existed on the face of the rock, whether it was something in the rock formations, a couple of cracks, and they would stare at it, and then suddenly their imagination would engage something pre-existing to create the whole painting. And the reason I mention that is because there is a similarity here, and it has to do with the question of what is it really that the religious imagination engages. And I think that it has to do with a deep sense of wonder. And that is a very important part of the equation of the evolution of religion. I don't know if it's a primordial wonder, but we do have a certain sense of deep wonder that has a lot to do with religion. And here it is the engagement of the engaging imagination with the sense of wonder that somehow completes it into the religious imagination. So I would just wonder if that's something to say.
No, I agree with that. I think that's certainly part of religious engagement and a good part of what is cultivated in religious experience. I'm trying to stay away from, trying to nail it down, but I absolutely agree with that. I would say, for instance, the example that I gave of Newgrange allows you to feel wonder at something so ordinary as the sun. And that is something that we can sort of think our way into from a modern perspective, but it's very hard to experience it. And it is, I went to Newgrange. You can go there to actually see it on the winter solstice. You have to get into a lottery. But what you can do if you go there on any day, there are tours, and then they recreate it for you, and it is wondrous.
By the way, talking about Carl Jung and wonder, he recounts his travels in Africa, where he actually saw a bunch of primates sitting on a little hill early in the morning and staring at the sunshine, just as the sun rose, the first rays, and they're all just sitting there every morning and just staring at it, perhaps with a deep sense of wonder. At least this is the sense that he had. So wonder is in a sense, a lot more prior to questioning. By the way, Heidegger is known for saying that questioning is the piety of thought. So he's a philosopher. But wonder, if you look at someone like Joshua Heschel, would say that wonder is really at the base of religion. Okay, thank you.
Great. So over here.
I've been hearing a lot about the positive aspects of the paranoid bliss, and I think all of us are eager for something transcendental. But Professor Krippel, you yourself have, I think, in your experience, have become a little leery of where we're going with transcendental. There's a reason, I think, why we moved from pre-enlightenment to enlightenment. It wasn't all negative. There were witches and people being burned at the stake, a lot of superstition. Could you tell us a little about the emotional chaos surrounding your research on Ramakrishna? Were there devotees who were fantastically in their transcendental state trying to attack you? I mean, how do you gauge what is positive transcendental, what is negative?
That's a big question. I'm not sure it's relevant to our conversation, but I'll address it very briefly. I think there are two poles of the study of religion. There's that pole that tries to look at these transcendent experiences and affirm some kind of vertical dimension, but there's also all of these methods and theories that try to address the horizontal, and particularly in this case, the body and human sexuality. And what made that work you're referring to so controversial was its insistence that you can't really understand the saint's ecstasies without taking his sexual orientation into account. And I was, it was very controversial. It was very difficult for many, many years. I wouldn't want to deny that. But I think the basic answer is I think you have to address both the vertical and the horizontal dimensions to really get a full picture of how religion works.
Okay. Next question over here.
Hey, thank you very much for the talks. I hope I can phrase my question correctly. The way I perceive a lot of the content is that it has some strong political implications in terms of being able to shift our ethical values, if you may. And I guess one aspect of the question is whether it was a decision to not inquire more into this. And I guess this comes from my understanding on the first talk that religion often offers engagement with that which is what we hold dear through all these aesthetic practices and rituals. And it seems to me that science perhaps does not as much. I mean, maybe unavoidable, science relies on some use of allegories and aesthetics, but could we imagine a scientific method that includes other areas or other ways of knowing that promote engagement with what we hold dear? Could we imagine I don't know, would you have an answer to this? I hope that was a clear question.
So there were two parts. The first part of the question was about the moral aspect of imagination. Is that right?
Yeah.
And then the second part was if science can contribute to imaginative engagement.
Or if imaginative engagement could contribute to like a more, if you want, socially or environmentally engaged production of science.
So the first question, I can just say briefly that imagination is a moral responsibility, and just briefly in this sense, for instance, racism is insidious because it enters into the imaginative level, and so we see the world a certain way. It's not just an interpretation of our experience. So we are responsible actually for what we engage and how we engage the world. So there is that moral dimension, I acknowledge that. About science and imaginative engagement, I'm still not really clear on the question, but I think I would so a more ecologically responsible science might be attended by might be aided by imagination. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't just say that about science. I would just say that that's about culture in general. So, I mean, if you talk to environmentalists, one of the problems they have is that we have all this knowledge about destruction of the environment, but it's somehow not penetrating behaviorally. And I think that there are a lot of sort of angles on that and a lot of work that needs to be done. But part of it is engagement. It is a problem of engaging the world imaginatively. In an ecologically sensitive way. A lot of cultures had that as part of their culture. We certainly don't, even though we know more about the environment than ever before.
Great. Okay, so over here, and I do see the laptop, and I'll just say, just in case you're going to make a quote, don't make it too long. People have done a good job with these big topics.
Yeah, thank you.
Keeping it brief, so.
My comment is on the nature of selective influence, of which Newton and Bacon are examples. So Bacon was not only the instigator of the scientific method as we know it, but also he was the leading Rosicrucian of his day. And my friend Peter Dawkins, for those who are interested, has devoted his life to uncovering this other part of Bacon. So far as Newton's concerned, as you probably know, his correspondence and papers was bought by Keynes in the 1930s, who then called him the last of the alchemists. And more recently, new books come out from Oxford University Press called Priest of Nature, and this is about the whole of Newton as a scientist and also as a mystical investigator. So I think because our culture was moving in this materialistic direction, philosophically and scientifically, these aspects of these two men were not influential, but maybe they can now become more influential. And here's a quote from Bacon to illustrate this. "Let the mind be enlarged to the grandeur of the mysteries, and not the mysteries contracted to the narrowness of the mind." Thank you.
So, comments on that?
I think it wasn't a question.
Sounds good. Okay, back over here.
I have a question for Jeffrey. I loved your metaphor of the broken twig and the signs in the forest, but those signs can only be interpreted if you know what kind of beasts live in the forest, so you can work out how they were produced. And I noticed you've skipped over the slide with Jacques Vallée, who is one of the few serious scientific researchers of the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah.
Now, I think that his project failed because although he did a lot of good science, he didn't have a deep theory about the nature of the UFO phenomenon.
Right.
So my question is it possible to make any headway in the study of paranormal without a deep philosophical understanding of consciousness? I have in mind, for example, idealism, which Benny Shannon found pervaded some entheogenic religions like Santo Daime. So can you actually do anything with the twigs without a deep theory of the beasts in the forest?
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course you can't. I think it's always a both and. You're lost in the forest trying to read the twigs, and you're developing a theory of where the elk herd is. And you're bouncing one off to the other constantly. And all I'm really suggesting is that these sorts of strange experiences that get taken off our academic table might actually contain clues that can get us to where we want to go. But I think you're right. We have to have some idea where we want to go before we can use the clues. I don't think it's just one or the other. And it's an analogy or metaphor. It's clearly failed.
Well, no, I think it's a great analogy, but we need to find the beasts.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, great. And hopefully we'll have just about enough time, if we're brief with each question and answer, to get through all of the questions. So back to the microphone over here.
Okay, I'll try to be brief. Addressed to Jeffrey Kripal. I wanted some more of your speculations, your hunches. Topic I'm interested in is emergence, an ontological change that maybe what we're studying all the time is not inert, but might have intent, and that some of these dreams, some of these altered experiences that are difficult to explain through current methodology, we might need methodological advances that somehow allow science entry, but possibly that what we're entering to explore might be aware of our exploring it.
So you're looking for comments on that? Anybody?
So it sounds great. But I don't understand the question, I guess.
Any thoughts you have on the topic of emergence?
Of emergence.
That consciousness as a whole.
Well, so this gets into what we call panpsychism, and it gets into what we call the combination problem. How a lot of little things add up to this 3D movie we're in right now. So I think emergence is kind of a halfway house between materialism and idealism. It kind of mediates between the two. But for me, it doesn't really solve the problems. It doesn't solve the combination problem of why a whole bunch of little conscious entities add up to Nathaniel here, or me. It just doesn't get us there. I understand why people are attracted to it, but it sounds to me like just another coded form of materialism.
Okay, great. We have about 6 minutes, so we'll go back over here.
I really congratulate Jeffrey on his talk. I could tell you 3 examples of precognitive experiences which saved lives, one of which was a severe car accident avoided at the Hotel Victoria Jungfrau down the road in 1976. Now, I have a serious question for you. You mentioned classical physics and quantum physics as if they were 2 mutually exclusive things. Are you aware that it's possible to put something in between the 2, and it has a very successful approach to explaining cognition?
No.
It explains cognition of forms in the sense that Plato used, and of gestalts in the sense developed out of the work of that famous German philosopher, Immanuel Kant. Now, if you'd like to know more, I will certainly like to discuss it with you.
Okay.
But it allows you to cognize forms through the mathematics introduced by René Thome in the mid-20th century.
Thank you.
It's a comment.
Okay. Over here. Oh, you were here first, so please. Yeah, he's yielded the mic to you.
So, well, first of all, I would like to thank both of you for your talks. I really...
You might need to be a little louder, closer to the microphone.
Okay. Is it better now? Okay.
Yeah.
So, yeah, thank you to both of you. I really enjoyed your talks, and I think I learned a lot from your perspectives. So my background is a little bit more different because I'm coming from science, and so I would have only a comment and a question for Jeffrey. So the comment would be more, well, I appreciate a lot your effort to try to bring this phenomenon to the table of science as well. But I guess also when you're addressing the matter, and you mentioned that scientists also coming out of the closet and stuff, I presume that you would not like to be disrespectful to them if you want to work with them, in the sense that scientists are not lazy or just ignoring or saying no to all this phenomenon, right? They are just saying, we don't know yet. So give me extra time so that I can solve easier problems, and then eventually I will try to help you. The ones saying no would be coming from other religions and beliefs, like Buddhism, which would say that all this phenomenon don't really exist because there is no mind, no consciousness, and etc. So I would say that it's a matter of, if you want to believe in something, what are you going to believe in? And that is where science is saying, I cannot tell you yet because I don't have proof, right? Okay, so my question very briefly for you would be, what are your thoughts on hallucinations and also visual illusions, for example?
On what?
Hallucinations and illusions.
Oh, you mean psychedelics and hallucinations?
Hallucinations, generally, I believe you said.
Generally. What are your thoughts? What comes to your mind?
I think it's tricky. I think a lot of course, religious visionary experience is hallucinatory in some sense, that someone's seeing something that's not, that other people can't see there. But I think sometimes the imagination kicks in a different way, and what's being imagined is in some ways a translation of something that's actually there. So this is what I was trying to get at the end of my talk with the theory of the imagination. I don't think we have an adequate theory of the imagination, not just on an ordinary level, but also on an extraordinary level. And I think that would be the key to an adequate theory of religion, which we just don't have.
Okay.
And what about illusions?
We have 1 minute left. It would be great if we're able to get to the last gentleman over there. Sorry. Yes.
Hi there. I actually have a request for the moderator. Would I be allowed to take the microphone over lunchtime and introduce perception theory and talk to people about perceptual mechanisms and how they are another form of sensory input to the brain that combines with sensory input, basically solves the binding problem? And following on from this speech, it has relevance. That's a request?
Did you say the question was to me?
No, there's no question. The request is, can I take the microphone over lunchtime?
I'm not sure I understood. I don't know if you were caught.
I think that's a question for the organizers of the conference.
Oh, yeah, so I'm chairing this session and can't take any responsibility beyond that. I was just roped into this particular, running this session, so. Would you want to answer that, Harold?
I'm not sure whether I understand what you want to do, but over the lunch break, actually, they have to clear this space, and so there will be no event taking place in this room. And I think what Matthew was just about to announce is that we are now going into the lunch break, and I think everybody might want to be back at 2 o'clock. You know, they will fill the water refrigerators and everything. They will put a little bit of fresh air in here, so I don't think this is a good place
Can I just raise, if people
good place
want
for another
yeah.
event in here. Thank you.
Well, yep, let's thank our speakers. And thanks to everybody.